Sisters, we begin today by trying to reflect on the gospel according to John. And once again, the most important words here are according to. So this is John's perspective. John has written about his experience of Jesus in this gospel. The Gospel of John is made up of 21 chapters, beginning in chapter 1, verse 1, and ending in chapter 21, verse 25. According to Ezekiel, who spoke about that creature, that figure with 4 faces, one of the faces was the face of an eagle. And in tradition, John has been identified with an eagle. And that is why the symbol which is used for the gospel of the evangelist John is that of an eagle. This is also mentioned by the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, the 4th living creature is like a flying eagle. Why has tradition identified the evangelist John with a flying eagle? Because when we read the Gospel of John, he gives us the perspective right from above. He gives us a very, very high perspective, a perspective from the skies. If we can talk about the Christology of Matthew, Mark, and Luke as what we would term as an ascending Christology, where Jesus, the human, becomes God, the evangelist John has what is known as a descending Christology, where God becomes human. So the perspective of the evangelist John is, you might say, the opposite of the perspective of the evangelists Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or as they are known, the Synoptic Gospels, because they can be seen together, they can be viewed together, they can be placed in parallel columns, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they have got a number of similarities and also a number of dissimilarities. So, however, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be seen together, can be placed side by side, and when there are similarities, they can be compared, the Gospel of John is quite different from these 3. And that is why, if Jesus is moving as from a human being moving up to the skies in the Gospel of John, he's coming down from the skies onto the earth. That is what I mean by saying that the Gospel of John has what is known as a descending Christology. Both of these, that is the perspective of the synoptics and the perspective of John, are different perspectives. They are not saying something different. They are looking at Jesus, looking at the Christ event, looking at the mystery of Jesus in a different way. Their perspective is different. It is from this high perspective, it is from the perspective of descending Christology, that is from top down, we must look at these characteristics of the Gospel of John. Because the Logos, that is the Word, which is Jesus, is already with the Father, John does not have in his gospel an infancy narrative. The infancy narrative is stories about the birth of Jesus, and these are found only in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Rather, in John, there is what is known as the prologue. And the meaning of the word prologue is the word before. Some call it an introduction, but introduction is not the best translation for prologue. It is better translated as the word before. That is what prologue means, and this is unique to the Gospel of John. There are many who are of the opinion that in these 18 verses, beginning from chapter 1, verse 1, and ending at chapter 1, verse 18, which is the prologue of the evangelist John, they believe that the summary of the whole Gospel of John is present. They say that in these 18 verses, everything that John says in his gospel is present in a summary form. That is, in the prologue itself, we are told about the reason for the logos, or the word, coming into our world. We are given in these 18 verses the response to that word, a positive response and a negative response, and we are given the effects of both the positive response and the negative response. And towards the end of the prologue, we are given the end of the gospel, where Jesus ascends and is once again, after coming down on earth, in the bosom of the Father. So therefore, prologue might not really be translated best as introduction, but as the word before John can explicate his gospel. The word before John can explain his gospel, because already in the 18 verses, he has summarized what is going to happen in the rest of his gospel. John's gospel does not mention the baptism of Jesus. It does mention about Jesus baptizing, though John is very, very clear when he tells us that Jesus did not actually baptize anybody, but he speaks in a veiled language about Jesus baptizing rather than about the baptism of Jesus. And the reason why John feels no need to mention the baptism of Jesus, because if in the baptism of Jesus, in the Gospels of Luke and Mark, very clearly, Jesus receives that invitation from his Father when he is addressed by the Father, "You are my beloved Son." When in the Gospel of Matthew, he is made known to the people through, "This is my beloved Son," in the Gospel of John, there is no need for this at all, because Jesus is very clearly, right from the very beginning, the Son of God. And that is why there is no temptation seen in the Gospel of John. As a matter of fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus seems above everyone and above everything. He can easily capture Satan, and that is why John does not feel the need to have exorcisms in his gospel. Satan, the devil, Beelzebul, is not present in people who are possessed in the Gospel of John, because there are no exorcisms at all. They are present in those who oppose Jesus and will not listen to what he says about God. So in John's gospel, there is no temptation seen, because Jesus cannot really be tempted. That is why it is only in the Gospel of John that there is no Simon of Cyrene. Jesus does not need help from any human being, whatever help Jesus needs, he gets from the Father. Because as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, the Father and I are one. He is so intimately connected with the Father that it is the Father who will come to his aid. And because the Father comes to his aid whenever Jesus requires the Father, there is no Gethsemane or agony in the garden. As a matter of fact, in chapter 17, just before the passion narrative, which begins in chapter 18, the chapter 17 is what is known as the priestly prayer of Jesus, where Jesus prays like a priest and in royal style without being in any agony whatever. This is why there is no temptation seen in the Gospel of John. John's Gospel does not contain any parables. Instead of parables, John has long discourses. And these discourses, like the signs or the miracles or the works, they reveal who Jesus is. If in the Gospel of Matthew, there are 5 long discourses which are spread through the Gospel of Matthew. In John's Gospel, the discourses are long, though not as long as some of them in the Gospel of Matthew. However, the discourses in the Gospel of John make a revelation about the person of Jesus. For example, in the discourse on the bread of life, or Jesus as the bread of life, we are given an insight into the ministry of Jesus. Jesus as the light of the world, or Jesus as the resurrection and the life, or Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. We are given an insight into the personality of Jesus, into who Jesus is through these discourses. The cleansing of the temple, which is an incident narrated also by the other evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though in some of those we cannot really regard them as cleansing. In John, very clearly, it is a cleansing. However, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the cleansing of the temple is narrated towards the end of the ministry of Jesus. And the reason is this, that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus goes to Jerusalem as an adult only once, and that is to suffer and die. As a matter of fact, all the 3 evangelists, Mark and Luke very clearly, and Matthew also, show Jesus moving from Galilee to Jerusalem to fulfill the mission which he has come for, to fulfill the mission for which he has been sent by the Father in Jerusalem. In the Gospel of John, Jesus goes to Jerusalem on at least 3, if not 4 occasions. So already at the beginning of the gospel, that is in chapter 2, immediately after the miracle of turning water into wine at Cana, Jesus is in Jerusalem and is cleansing the temple. However, even as John narrates this scene, as John narrates this incident, he narrates it in a different way from the synoptics. John is the only one who will tell us that Jesus made a whip of cords. John is the only one who will tell us that Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. So John gives us in the incident of the cleansing of the temple his own perspective about what he thinks the temple is and how Jesus views the temple. And in that statement which Jesus makes, namely, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. When the people respond that it has taken 46 years to build the temple and ask if he can raise it in 3 days after having taken 46 years, the disciples remember that he was speaking about the temple, which was his body. So, in other words, as far as John is concerned, the cleansing of the temple, which is for worship, and notice, unlike in the synoptics, which speak about the Father's house being turned into a den of robbers, John does not quote Jeremiah, den of robbers. John speaks about the Father's house being turned into a marketplace. So in John, the allegation that Jesus makes against the religious leaders is that they are using the temple for trade. They are using the temple for business. They are using the temple to buy and sell, not so much to rob people like Mark will say, like Matthew will say, but in John, the people are not even allowed to buy and sell, because even buying and selling, forget about robbing, that comes much later, but even buying and selling according to the Gospel of John ought not to be done in the temple. In the temple, there must only be worship of God and not worship of money. The washing of the feet is exclusive to the Gospel of John. Every year, on Maundy Thursday, in the liturgy of the church, two separate liturgies are celebrated. It is only in the Gospel of John at the supper that Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he does not wash the feet of the disciples, but he breaks bread. This bread is not broken in the Gospel of John at the Last Supper. As a matter of fact, in chapter 6, verses 1 to 12, which is the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, in which 12 baskets are gathered, there, besides other changes, John makes 2 very, very significant changes. And they are this: that when Jesus takes the bread, he looks up to heaven and he gives thanks. In the feeding of the 5,000, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus looks up to heaven, he says the blessing. The Greek word for blessing is eulogein, and the Greek word for thanksgiving is eucharistein. So in other words, by using the verb eucharistein, or giving thanks, what John is possibly saying is that when Jesus breaks the bread with the 5,000, he is celebrating the Eucharist with them. That is why he does not need to show Jesus as breaking bread at the Last Supper. Jesus has done that already with this large crowd of 5,000. The second change which John makes, as I said, besides many others, is Jesus gives the bread in John to the people himself. In the Synoptic Gospels, he gives the bread to the disciples who give it to the people. So in John, there are no intermediaries. It is as if Jesus is giving himself to the people when he gives the bread. Of course, even the command, gather up all these fragments that none of them may be lost. The fact that the Passover is drawing near, these are other changes that John makes to bring into much, much greater relief that for him, the breaking of the bread at the Last Supper is not necessary, because Jesus has done that already with his disciples and with this large crowd. On Maundy Thursday, therefore, the liturgy of the church includes both of these beautiful symbols, namely the washing of the feet, which can be linked therefore, to the breaking of the bread of the Synoptic Gospels. So we notice that while John and the Synoptics are giving us the same message, namely that Jesus is willing to break himself completely, the symbols they use are different. John is saying that Jesus' willingness to break himself is shown through his washing the disciples' feet. The Synoptic Gospels are saying that Jesus' willingness to break himself is shown by Jesus breaking bread and identifying the bread with his body. The number 7 is considered the perfect number. There are 7 days in the week. And that's why 7 was considered perfection. This is the reason possibly why John has only 7 miracles in his gospel. The evangelist does not refer to these as miracles. The evangelist, that is John, calls them signs. The Greek word is semeion, sign, semeia, signs, the plural. So semeion is the first sign at Cana in Galilee. Semeion is the second sign at healing of the official son. So Jesus, as far as the evangelist is concerned, uses these signs. Now, why does John use the word signs and not miracles? Because he wants his readers to realize the meaning of a sign. And what is a sign? A sign is not an end in itself. A sign points to something beyond it. So when I see a sign, I get an indication of the reality. When I see a sign of a particular place, the name of a place, and I look, for example, and I see that this board is showing me the name of a place and it is showing me it is 5 kilometers away, the sign tells me that within 5 kilometers, I will reach my destination. The sign is not the reality. The sign is pointing beyond itself to the reality. So what the evangelist is saying, that at the end of the miracle at Cana, where Jesus turns water into wine, and at the end he says, this was the first of the signs that Jesus worked. He's telling us, don't get caught up with the sign. Look beyond it to see what the sign is saying. Jesus, when he refers to his own, what we consider miracles, refers to them as works. So the Father is working, and so I am working. So it is in a day's work as far as Jesus is concerned. The miracles, keep in mind, are never and must never be seen as an appendix, as an addition to Jesus. They are not something which Jesus adds to himself from outside to try to prove that he is the Messiah, to try to prove that he's Son of God. Never. As a matter of fact, in the Synoptic Gospels, whenever Jesus is asked for a sign, where sign is a bad word in the Synoptics, when Jesus is asked for a sign in the Synoptic Gospels, he refuses to give a sign, because there are no signs to be given except what he's already doing. So the works Jesus speaks about are the works which he does almost naturally and should not be seen as a proof of his divinity, should not be seen as a proof that he is God's son, or as a proof that he is a miracle worker and so greater than others. No, the miracles or the works are part of Jesus' mission. It is only in the Gospel of John that we come across this character who is called the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple is often identified with the evangelist. This is a character found only in the Gospel of John, and up to chapter 12, we do not find him at all. It is from chapter 13, beginning with the incident of the washing of the feet, that we come across this character. Mary, The mother of Jesus is never referred to by name in the gospel. The evangelist John refers to her by using two titles. One is the mother of Jesus and or his mother. So therefore, this is how the evangelist refers to Mary. In the Gospel of John, Jesus addresses his mother directly twice. And both the times when he speaks with her, he calls her woman. Now, while this word woman is not a bad term, it is surely not an endearing term. It is a term which maintains some distance. And the reason why Jesus in John uses the term woman is because of this. Very, very, very clearly, the Father's will, that is, his God, his Father, is primary. It takes precedence over everything else and over everyone else. No one, nothing can come between Jesus and his Father's will. And that is why in the miracle at Cana, when Mary comes to Jesus' notice, she makes no request of him. She simply points to the situation and says, they have no wine. She does not tell him, please turn this water into wine. She does not tell him, please help these people. She does not tell him the bridegroom is going to be embarrassed and people are going to make fun of him. She says nothing of that sort. She only says to her son, they have no wine. Now Jesus responds to Mary by calling her woman, gunai ti emoi kai soi. That is the Greek, gunai ti emoi kai soi. That means, what to me and you. In other words, translated loosely, it would mean, mind your own business. Translated in another way, it would mean, please do not disturb me. Translated in another way, it would mean, but why are you coming to me? And then we know that these are translations which are correct, because the next phrase which Jesus uses is, my hour has not yet come. And what is this hour? This theme of the hora, which is the Greek word for hour, is a very, very important theme in the Gospel of John. The hour is the hour which is set by the Father. It is only the Father who controls that hour, and Jesus moves according to the hour set by the Father. So when the Father sets the hour, and when the Father says this has to be done, Jesus will do it. No human being can tell him. No human being can hasten it. No human being can ask him to bring it closer and closer. And yet, even though his mother does not make a request of him, even though he almost insults his mother by telling her, mind your own business, and giving her the reason, my hour has not yet come, Jesus works the miracle, or he performs the sign, or he does his work because of the intervention of Mary. So we can see the power of Mary. Jesus would bow to no human being in the Gospel of John. Jesus is unafraid of no one in the Gospel of John. Jesus will do no one any favors in the Gospel of John. Jesus will only follow the hour and the Father's will, because according to John 4:34, he says very clearly his food and his drink is to do the will of the Father. And yet, here, right at the beginning of the gospel, he works the miracle at the behest of his mother. It shows the influence Mary has on him. It shows how endeared Jesus was to Mary. It shows that Jesus would listen to his mother, even if at first glance it might seem he did not. And here too, we notice Mary's response to her son's almost aggression. Gunai ti emai kai soi. What to me and to you, my hour has not yet come. Notice Mary, she does not sulk. She does not say, my son, I did so much for you. I brought you up and now you're shouting at me like this. You're treating me like this. She doesn't say anything of that sort. As a matter of fact, she does not even respond to the words of Jesus. She gives directions to the servants saying, and this is what she constantly says, do whatever he tells you. Not what I tell you. Do whatever he tells you. At the end of the gospel, it is only John the evangelist who will show Mary standing at the foot of the cross. And at the foot of the cross is Mary, the beloved disciple, and the Lord hanging on the cross. The second time, Mary is addressed by Jesus as Gunai, woman, this is your son. And to the disciple, Jesus says, this is your mother. The beloved disciple is not only a historical character. The beloved disciple is anyone who loves Jesus. So therefore, if anyone loves Jesus, whether male or female, whether child or youth, whether young or old, if anyone loves Jesus, they have to take his mother into their home. There can be, in the Gospel of John, no church without Mary. In John's ecclesiology, that is, theology of the church, there are three elements. First, the church in John is founded at the foot of the cross. That is what is important to keep in mind, and we must keep this in mind constantly, that the church is at the foot of the cross. This is the foundation of the church, the cross, and today we celebrate the feast of the exaltation of the cross. So we remember that the church is at the foot of the cross. And then the three elements are the Spirit of Jesus given from the cross. The Spirit of Jesus, not merely the Spirit of Jesus, but the Spirit of Jesus given from the cross, because John will tell us that once the handing over is done, Jesus breathes his last before he says it is accomplished. So he breathes. So the breath of Jesus, the Spirit of Jesus given from the cross, the Spirit of the crucified Jesus. That's the first element. The second is the mother of Jesus. She's standing there at the foot of the cross. And the third is the beloved disciple, anyone who loves Jesus. So in the Gospel of John, there is no institution which makes up the church. In the Gospel of John, these three elements are integral and only necessary to make up the church, which are the Spirit of Jesus, the Mother of Jesus, and the beloved disciple. If these three elements are present, there is church. And so, while church is individuals gathered together, church is also an individual. So if I, as an individual, obey the Spirit of Jesus given from the cross, and I take the Blessed Mother into my heart, I also am church. Community is important, surely. Gathering together is important, surely. And meeting together physically is important, surely. But during these times, we must remember that even if we cannot meet together physically and are meeting together only virtually, each one of us makes up the church as far as John is concerned. That much about the Mother of Jesus. In the Synoptic Gospels, and especially in Mark, and Matthew follows Mark, 3 times Jesus speaks about his death and resurrection. We called those the passion and resurrection predictions in the Gospel of Mark. Luke also has them, and Matthew has them, largely copied from Mark. 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, 8:31, 9:31, 10:32 to 34, Jesus speaks about being rejected, being crucified, dying, and rising. And that is why we call them the passion and resurrection predictions. Here in the Gospel of John, 3 times also, Jesus speaks of hupsu. That's the Greek word hupsu. The reason why I use the Greek word hupsu is because hupsu can have 2 meanings. And the first meaning is lifted up on the cross. What does lifted up on the cross mean? The vertical stake which made up the cross, that is from top to down stake which made up the cross, was already fixed at the place of crucifixion. It was already in the ground. So everywhere there were vertical stakes. What the condemned person would carry would be the horizontal bar which was strapped behind his back. And the person with the arms spread out, with the arms stretched behind the back, would be the horizontal beam. So not so much the cross fully, but only the horizontal beam would be carried, because the vertical stake was already at the place of crucifixion. Around the neck of the criminal would be tied a cord, and on that cord a plaque which indicated the crime for which this particular criminal was being crucified. In the case of Jesus, as we shall see later, it was Jesus, the Nazarene, King of the Jews, INRI or JNRJ, Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Judaeorum. Jesus, Jesus Nazarenum, Jesus the Nazarene, or the Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, Rex Judaeorum, King of the Jews. So that will be carried. So Jesus is going to be, so when Jesus reaches the place of crucifixion, they would put him on the ground, the crossbeam still behind his back, and he would be lying on his back, and they would tie his hands with cord. They would put the nails, in all probability, into the wrists more than the palm, because the wrists were heavier. The wrist would not sort of pull down. The palm possibly would pull down. The palm would tear if it was put in the palm. So in all probability, the nails were put in the wrists of Jesus, and then this horizontal beam would be taken up like this and put into the vertical beam. So the horizontal beam would be hupsu, lifted up. And as the horizontal beam was lifted up, Jesus, who was crucified to it, would be lifted up. So when Jesus says hupsu, he means lifted up on the cross. However, the same verb hupsu, lifted up, can also mean lifted up into heaven. And in the Gospel of John, there are a number of words which double meaning. The double meaning is an indication that John wants us to understand both of these terms. So in the Gospel of John, when 3 times Jesus speaks about being lifted up, he is speaking about both being lifted up on the cross and being lifted up into heaven. That is his ascension. You might say that it is through his being lifted up on the cross that Jesus ascends into heaven. You might say it is because Jesus is lifted up on the cross that he is also lifted up into heaven. And this becomes clear when we see the predicate of what is said each time in these verses. In chapter 3, verse 14, this is what we read. Just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him will have eternal life. So what John is doing here, through the words of Jesus, is that he is comparing the bronze serpent with the crucified Christ. And as people who were bitten by serpents looked at the bronze serpent and lived, people who are sinners will look at the crucified Christ and not only live, but have eternal life. So can you imagine? It is from the cross that Jesus is giving those who crucify him eternal life. In chapter 8, verse 28, the second of the 3 hupsus, and when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am. I am is the Greek ego eimi. And ego eimi is the name in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, which God gave to Moses when Moses asks God for God's name. God says, I am who am. So what Jesus is saying in this chapter 8, verse 28 is this. When you lift me up, then you will know that you are lifting up, you are crucifying God. So it is God whom we are crucifying. It is God whom we are nailing to a tree. And in the third one, chapter 12, verse 32, the climax and the last of the 3 hupsus. And you, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, and I, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. And I, when I am lifted up on the cross, will draw all people to myself. So in other words, Jesus will not push people away when he is crucified. Jesus will not condemn people when he is crucified. Jesus will not get upset and shout and get angry with people when he is crucified. No, what he will do is he will draw people to himself. So people would be inspired by this crucified Christ. The character Nathanael is mentioned only by the Gospel of John. Once at the beginning of the Gospel, when Jesus identifies him as an Israelite in whom there is no guile, and the other time in the last chapter of the Gospel when he is present with 6 other disciples at Lake Tiberias when they go fishing and catch nothing. Tradition has identified Nathanael with Bartholomew And Bartholomew is a name mentioned in all the 4 lists of the 12 disciples, that is, in the Synoptic Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles. The lists of the 12 are available in these 4 places, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also in the Acts of the Apostles. There is no list of the disciples in the Gospel of John, but Nathanael has been identified with Bartholomew, who is listed in the list of 12. Nathanael does not find mention in any list of the 12, nor does he find mention either in the Synoptic Gospels or in the Acts of the Apostles. He is a character exclusive to the Gospel of John. Now, for the Synoptics, this metaphor, the kingdom, is an important metaphor. Mark and Luke use the kingdom of God. Matthew uses the kingdom of God very seldom, but often uses kingdom of heaven. But the kingdom is important for the Synoptic Gospel. John uses kingdom only 5 times in his Gospel. Instead of kingdom, John uses the pronoun I. So Jesus brings the kingdom. Jesus stands for the kingdom. Jesus is the kingdom, and much more. So the pronoun I is used by John 118 times, much more than any of the Synoptic Gospels use this pronoun of Jesus. As I said earlier, there are 7 miracles in the Gospel of John. Now, 4 of these 7 miracles are exclusive to John. That is, first, the miracle at Cana, where Jesus turns water into wine. The paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. Now, there are healings of paralytics in the Synoptic Gospels, like the paralytic let down from the roof in Mark chapter 2. However, the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, which is in John 5, 1-9, is narrated in quite a different way, as is the miracle of the man born blind. There are healings of the blind in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For example, in Mark chapter 8, verses 22-26, there is the healing of the blind man in 2 stages. In Mark chapter 10, verses 46-52, there is the healing of blind Bartimaeus. However, the healing of this man in the Gospel of John is very differently narrated from that of the Synoptic Gospels. As a matter of fact, here at the beginning of chapter 9, verse 1, Jesus gives us a very beautiful insight into the connection between blindness, or between sin and blindness, between sin and any ailment. Now we can say between sin and COVID. The disciples ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Now, first of all, if the man is born blind, how could he have sinned? So you see the question, sometimes the question can be very foolish. Before he was born, can he have sinned? When you're being told that the man is born blind, what kind of a question to ask? Did he or his parents sin? You could ask, did his parents sin? Did his grandparents sin? As some people are want to say that because of the sin of the forefathers, we are suffering today. And Jesus says, no, neither he nor his parents sinned, but because the glory of God has to be revealed. And this is how I would like us to interpret our own question in case we ask God, Lord, who sinned? Which one of us sinned because of which we have to go through this COVID-19 pandemic? And I would say, read the answer of Jesus in John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, and use it for your own personal reflection on our response to this pandemic. The raising of Jairus' daughter is found in all the synoptics, and the Gospel of Luke has another miracle of the raising of the widow's son at Nain in chapter 7. So Luke's is the only gospel which has got two raisings. He mentioned the widow's son at Nain and also Jairus' daughter. Matthew and Mark only mention the raising of Jairus' daughter. John, however, has a raising, but it is not of Jairus' daughter, nor of the widow's son at Nain. It is of Lazarus. And this raising of Lazarus is once again a very, very beautiful text in which we are given an insight into the faith of Jesus and the trust which Jesus has in his Father. So these four miracles, the miracle at Cana, the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, the man born blind, and the raising of Lazarus, are found only in the Gospel of John. There are three other miracles, which are the healing of the official son, which in the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew and Luke are known as the healing of the centurion's son. Now here, the official is possibly a Jewish official rather than a centurion, but the manner of narration is similar. The feeding of the 5,000, and the numbers are the same. There are 5 loaves, there are 2 fish, there are 12 baskets which are gathered, but John narrates this miracle quite differently from the synoptics, as also the miracle which follows in Matthew and Mark, not in Luke. That is the miracle of walking on the water. The miracle of walking on the water is found in Matthew, Mark, and John, not in the Gospel of Luke. And it seems that these miracles were together in tradition. That is why in Matthew, Mark, and in John, these miracles follow one after the other. We notice in John, the feeding of the 5,000 is in chapter 6, verses 1 to 13. After that, Jesus sees that they want to make him king. In verses 14 and 15, he escapes from the people. And in verse 16 to 20, we are told about the miracle of Jesus walking on the water, coming to their disciples in their need. John likes the number 7 because it is a symbol of perfection. And there are 7 I am sayings without predicate nominative. That means without saying something after I am. Here, when Jesus says to the Samaritan woman, when she talks about the Messiah and she asks about the Messiah, Jesus responds, I am. The second time, when he comes walking on the water to the disciples, he's walking on the water, something which only God does in the Old Testament, and he tells them not to be afraid. He wants them to be fearless because he is God. When he's speaking with the people and the religious authorities, that unless they believe in him, and that is what he has come for, he has come to reveal God's love to them, that they will die in their sins unless they believe that he is. And this is what we saw a little while earlier, the second of the Hupsu sayings in the Gospel of John, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, that is, when you have lifted up the Son of Man on the cross, then you will know that you are crucifying God. Jesus is the eternal Logos. And that's why he can say, before Abraham ever was, I am. He is talking with his disciples about things that will happen later. And he says, I am telling you all of this now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will know that I am. And finally, in the garden, when they come to arrest him, the Johannine Jesus does not run away. He gives himself up and identifies himself as God, giving himself up for everyone. Like the I am without predicate nominative, namely simply I am, there are also exactly 7 I am sayings with a predicate. And the first of these is after Jesus has fed the 5,000. I am the bread of life. In chapter 7, Jesus heals, or in chapter 9, Jesus heals the man born blind. So in that context, for the second time, and in one context, for the first time in chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus speaks of himself as the light of the world. Jesus is the gate for the sheep, and the gate for the sheep does two things. It allows the sheep to come in and to go out. However, as gate for the sheep, it also prevents outsiders or unauthorized persons from coming in. This is the metaphor of the sheep gate. Not only, however, is Jesus the gate for the sheep, he's also the good shepherd. He knows each sheep by name, and he leads them out to green pastures and brings them once again to safety. In the context of the death of Lazarus, whom Jesus will raise, even before raising Lazarus, Jesus will say to Martha that he is indeed the resurrection and the life. When he's talking with his disciples in chapter 14, which begins a number of series of discourses, he speaks of himself as the way that leads to the truth and that leads also to life. And finally, in chapter 15, he speaks of himself as the true vine and of his Father as the vine dresser, and every one of his disciples as part of the vine or as branches of the vine. Finally, the structure of the Gospel of John may be seen to be divided into these parts. The Gospel begins with the prologue, which might be translated as the word before. The second broad part in chapter 1, verse 19 to chapter 12, verse 50, can be seen, and most see it as the book of signs. Notice, it is only within this part that John narrates all 7 miracles. There are no miracles whatever in the second half of the Gospel of John. The book of signs will be seen, as I said, in summary form as positive encounters, as negative encounters. So those who accept Jesus, those who oppose Jesus, those who reject him, and because of this rejection, there is the preparation for glorification. And that is why this third part of the book, or the second broad part of the book, might be seen as the book of glory, beginning in chapter 13, verse 1 to chapter 20, verse 31. This farewell discourse begins with Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, with Jesus predicting his betrayal and his denial. And then from chapter 14 till the end of chapter 17, a variety of discourses, both of who Jesus is and of the advocate or helper whom Jesus will send to continue the work that he has begun. The second part of the book of glory is what might be termed as the Passion Discourse in chapter 18, verse 1 to chapter 19, verse 42, and finally, the Resurrection Discourse in chapter 20, verses 1 to 31. John is the only evangelist who has 2 whole chapters, 20 and 21, dedicated to the resurrection. And though the last chapter is known as the Epilogue, it is also a chapter in which John will continue the resurrection appearances of the risen Jesus.